I think Papa looks at her the way he used to look at Mama. The Duke's son told his sister. And the story began. It was Master Oliver Fenwick, 9 years old, and possessed of his father's unsparing gray eyes, who first said it aloud. He said it to his sister Cecily, 7, who was sitting on the nursery windowsill with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the garden below where their father stood beside the new music teacher, both of them looking at a score of Schubert spread open on the stone balustrade. Their father, Edmund Fenwick, Duke of Hartwell, was not a man who leaned toward things. He stood very straight and very still in most circumstances, as though the world required his structural support. But he was leaning now not much, not enough for a stranger to remark upon it just fractionally, the way a tall tree bends in a wind it has not yet decided to acknowledge. And Miss Cordelia Vane, the music teacher, was not leaning at all. She stood with her spine straight and her chin level, pointing to something on the page with the tip of her pencil, saying something that made the corners of her mouth turn with the faint suggestion of dry amusement. She did not look at the Duke the way women usually looked at the Duke, with calculation, with hope, with the careful performance of being looked at. She looked at the score. Cecily pressed her nose to the cold glass. "Do you think she knows?" she asked. Oliver considered this with the gravity of a child who has already understood that adults are frequently the last to know the most important things. "No," he said, "not yet." Hartwell Park sat in the deep countryside of Wiltshire like a man who has decided, after long deliberation, to remain exactly where he is. The house was Palladian, immense, and given to silences that accumulated in corners and settled over rooms like fine dust. It had been a house of two voices for 3 years, now a father's controlled baritone and the rushing counterpoint of two children who had not yet learned to be quiet, and the silences between those voices were sometimes very loud indeed. Edmund Fenwick had been the fifth Duke of Hartwell since the age of 28, when his father had died quietly in the library armchair, as though making one final effort not to inconvenience anyone. He was 34 now, broadly built and dark-haired, with the kind of authority that rooms adjusted themselves around without being asked. He was not unkind. He was not cold. He was simply a man who had loved one person with his entire self, had lost her to a fever 3 years past, and had arranged what remained of his interior life into something functional and efficient, and approximately nothing else. Miss Cordelia Vane arrived on a Thursday in October with a battered leather case containing her music, her credentials from the Royal Academy, and a complete indifference to the grandeur of Hartwell Park that Edmund would only later recognize as one of the most unusual things about her. She was 26. Her hair was the dark red-brown of autumn bracken, her eyes a clear hazel that registered everything without announcing it, and her hands, the hands of a working musician, were ink-stained at the left forefinger and completely unadorned. She had been engaged to teach Cecily the pianoforte and Oliver the violin. She had not been engaged to look at Edmund Fenwick's Schubert scores with the expression of someone who found them genuinely interesting and had thoughts about them. She had not been engaged to disagree with him about the second movement. She did both within the first 40 minutes. Above them in the nursery window, Oliver watched his father's expression do something it had not done in 3 years. He paid attention. Miss Vane had been at Hartwell Park for exactly 4 days when she told the Duke he was wrong about Schubert. She did not say it to provoke him. She said it the way she said most things directly, without preliminary softening, because she had learned long ago that excessive tact in musical matters cost more than it saved. She said, "The second movement wants breathing room. You're conducting it like a man trying to win an argument rather than finish a thought." Edmund had come to the music room to retrieve a letter he'd left on the mantelpiece. He had not come to discuss Schubert. He was not, by temperament or habit, a man who lingered in rooms where a lesson was in progress. But Cecily had been at the pianoforte, playing the impromptu in G-flat with rather more feeling than accuracy, and Miss Vane had been standing beside her with her pencil hovering above the score, and the phrase had arrived in Edmund's ears at precisely the moment he reached for his letter. He had, against his better judgment, stopped. "I beg your pardon," he said. The second movement. Miss Vane did not look up from the score. Most people rush it. It sounds like efficiency. It is actually a failure of nerve. She made a small notation. She. Cecily. Again from the double bar. Slower. Let it arrive. Cecily played. The phrase opened differently, unhurried. The silences between notes suddenly inhabited rather than merely absent. Edmund stood with his letter in his hand and listened to his daughter play Schubert the way he had never heard it played in this house. "I was not conducting anything," he said finally. "I was listening." "Then you were listening too fast." Miss Vane looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were entirely direct. "Your Grace." "I." The addendum arrived with the precision of something remembered rather than forgotten. Edmund looked at her for a moment. She did not arrange her expression for his inspection. She simply waited, pencil in hand, for him to either argue or leave. He found he did not particularly want to do either. He left. But in the corridor outside the music room, he stood for a full minute with his letter unopened, listening to the Schubert continue unhurried, breathing, arriving, and the silence in his chest, which had been very dense for 3 years, registered something that felt uncomfortably like a crack. Upstairs, Oliver heard the music change. He pressed his ear to the nursery floor and listened. Oliver Fenwick had been 9 years old for 3 months and was already the kind of child who made adults feel, uneasily, that they were being assessed. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's habit of arriving at conclusions without announcing them, and he had spent 3 years observing a household run on controlled grief, and was therefore something of an expert on the subject. He liked Miss Vane immediately, which surprised him, because he had not liked any of the previous tutors. He liked her because she did not speak to him and Cecily as though they were china figurines likely to shatter under honest conversation. She spoke to them as though they were people who happened to be small, which they were. "Do you like music?" she asked him at his first violin lesson, which was not the question his previous tutor had asked. His previous tutor had asked whether he had been practicing, which was a different kind of question entirely. "I like it when it sounds like something," Oliver said carefully. Rather than exercises." Miss Vane considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Then we'll start with something that sounds like something," she said. "The exercises can earn their place later." That was when Oliver decided she could be trusted with the observation he had made from the nursery window. He delivered it at the end of the lesson, while putting his violin away, in the tone of someone sharing a scientific finding. "My father looked at you in the garden," he said, "not the way he looks at most people." Miss Vane paused in the act of closing the score. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with perfect steadiness, "How does he look at most people?" 1. "Like he's waiting for them to finish so he can think about something else." Oliver fastened his case. "He wasn't doing that." "I see." Miss Vane set the score on the piano. Her expression gave away nothing, but Oliver noticed her left hand press briefly flat against the lid, as though steadying something. "That is useful information. Thank you, Oliver." She said it the way adults said things when they were thinking quite hard about something they had not expected to think about at all. Oliver filed this away. He had a feeling it would matter later. The portrait of the late Duchess of Hartwell hung in the East Gallery, and Cordelia had been at Hartwell Park for 2 weeks before she found herself standing in front of it. She had not gone looking for it. She had taken a wrong turn, returning from the library. The house was vast and given to misleading corridors, and had found herself in a long gallery where the afternoon light came through tall windows and fell across a dozen generations of Fenwick faces, and there, at the far end, was a portrait so recently hung that the gilt on the frame had not yet entirely settled. The Duchess had been painted young, perhaps 25, in a cream evening gown. She was fair-haired and fine-featured, with a particular kind of beauty that looks effortless because it has stopped trying. But what arrested Cordelia was not the face. It was the expression, a quality of unguarded warmth directed at something beyond the frame, as though the painter had caught her in the moment before she remembered to compose herself. She had been loved very much, Cordelia thought, and had known it. Her name was Margaret. The Duke's voice, directly behind her. Cordelia did not startle. She had good nerves, but she felt her pulse adjust. She was 27 when she died, Edmund continued. He came to stand beside Cordelia at a distance that was entirely proper, and somehow still closer than expected. He looked at the portrait with the expression of a man who has looked at it many times and is still not entirely finished with it. The children have her quickness. Oliver has her way of going directly at things without announcing himself first. And Cecily? Cordelia asked. Cecily has her laugh. Exactly her laugh. He said it quietly, as though the words had some weight he was managing carefully. I wasn't expecting to hear it again. Cordelia looked at the portrait. She did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not diminish what he had just offered her, this small, precise grief, delivered without performance. I am sorry, she said at last, for what it is worth from someone who did not know her. How? It is worth something. Edmund looked at her then, directly, with the gray eyes that assessed everything, more than most condolences, which tend toward the ornate. They stood together in the gallery until the light changed. Neither of them suggested moving, neither of them entirely noticed, until later, that they had been still together for a very long time. Cordelia Vane had 3 rules she had made for herself on the journey from London to Wiltshire, in the racketing coach, with her battered music case on her knees and the countryside rolling past the window like a patient argument. The first, she would be excellent at her work, because her work was the only thing that was entirely hers, and she intended to keep it so. The second, she would be kind to the children without becoming indispensable to them, because indispensable was a weight that moved with you when you left, and she had been indispensable to a family before, and had felt, when they no longer needed her, the particular loneliness of a purpose that had expired. The third, she would not think about the Duke. The third rule had been failing since approximately the second movement of Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat. It was not that she found him handsome, though she did, in the way one finds certain landscapes handsome, something that has been shaped by weather into a form that is more interesting than beauty. It was not the authority, which she found mildly irritating rather than impressive. It was the quality of his attention when he was not being a duke, in the library when he was reading, in the garden when he was watching the children, in the music room doorway with his letter in his hand, listening to Schubert with an expression she could only describe as hungry. A man who listened like that was a man who still wanted things. That was, she understood clearly, the most dangerous kind. She was reviewing her rules in the garden on a cold Tuesday morning when Cecily appeared at her elbow with the focused determination of a child who has decided something. Will you teach Papa? Cecily asked. He plays the pianoforte. He used to play with Mama. He doesn't play anymore. Bor, hata. Cordelia looked at her carefully. Does he know you're asking me this? No, but he would say yes, if you asked him. He says yes to most things you say. Cecily stated this as simple fact. Oliver noticed it first. Cordelia looked back at the house, where Edmund was visible through the study window, sitting at his desk, his head bent over correspondence. The morning light fell across his shoulders. She revised her third rule. She did not abolish it. She simply made room, as one makes room in a full room, by rearranging what was already there. I'll ask him, she said. Edmund had not sat at a pianoforte in 3 years, 2 months, and though he would not have admitted to counting 11 days, he sat at one now, because Miss Vane had asked him to, and he had discovered, in the 3 weeks since her arrival, that Miss Vane's requests arrived without the usual social scaffolding of requests, the apologetic preamble, the excessive politeness designed to make refusal comfortable. She simply asked, directly, with a clear implication that the answer was his business and the question was hers. He found it, on balance, easier than being managed. The last time you played? She said, settling onto the bench beside him at a distance. Cecily's presence in the doorway made entirely appropriate. What were you playing? Brahms, the intermezzo in A major. He said it without thinking, and then sat with the information for a moment, because he had not said it aloud before. Margaret liked Brahms. It was, we played together sometimes. She had a lighter touch than I do. Most people do, said Miss Vane without malice. You play like a man thinking out loud. It's not a fault. End quote. It's a different instrument than the one the composer intended. She said a simple Bach prelude on the stand. Start here, not for the sake of the piece, for the sake of the hands remembering. He played. Badly at first, stiff, self-conscious, 3 years of silence in his fingers. Miss Vane did not wince. She sat with the particular stillness of a listener who is receiving information rather than waiting for it to be over. Again, she said, but this time, don't play it correctly. Play it as if you're the only person in the room. You are in the room, Locke. Pretend otherwise. He played it again. Something loosened, not much, not enough to be visible to anyone who was not paying close attention. But Miss Vane was paying close attention, and she nodded once, precisely the way she nodded when the children did something right. Edmund felt the nod land somewhere he had not expected. In the doorway, Cecily turned to Oliver, who had appeared silently beside her. They watched their father's shoulders descend by a fraction of an inch. There, Oliver said quietly. That. Lady Harriet Voss arrived at Hartwell Park on a Saturday in November with a maid, a footman, 2 trunks, and the stated intention of visiting her cousin Edmund for a fortnight, which everyone in the household understood to mean that she had heard about the music teacher. Harriet was 31, twice widowed, and possessed of the kind of social intelligence that registered everything and filed it immediately under its correct heading. She had been the closest of Margaret's friends. She had also, since Margaret's death, maintained the considered position that Edmund needed to be loved again and was being extraordinarily stubborn about it. She met Cordelia at dinner on the first evening. She watched Edmund pass the salt without being asked. He had, evidently, observed that Miss Vane used salt more than the household's standard provision, and she watched Miss Vane accept it with a thank you that was entirely natural rather than performed. And she watched Edmund not watch Miss Vane watch the candelabra, and she set down her wine glass and understood the entire situation in approximately 4 minutes. She cornered Cordelia in the morning room before breakfast the following day. He's not been like this since Margaret, she said without preamble. Whatever you've done, you should know that. Cordelia looked at her steadily over her coffee. I have taught his children music and argued with him about Schubert. Yes, that's exactly what I mean. Harriet sat down across from her. Margaret used to argue with him. He always said it was one of his favorite things about her. The fact that she treated his opinions as something worth disagreeing with, rather than something to be endured or deferred to. She paused. He's been very thoroughly deferred to for 3 years. Cordelia was quiet. Then, I am the music teacher, Lady Voss. Yes, Harriet said, and I am telling you that in this house, that is not as simple as it sounds. She rose. I'm not warning you off. I want to be clear about that. I'm simply telling you what I see. She moved toward the door, then stopped. The children adore you. I watch them at dinner, live. End quote. I watched. They keep looking at you and then at him, back and forth, like people watching something they've been hoping for. After she left, Cordelia sat with her cooling coffee and thought about Oliver's gray eyes and his careful, deliberate observations, and felt the precise weight of being seen by a household that had been waiting, without knowing it, for something to change. It was Oliver who arranged it. He did it with the surgical precision of a 9-year-old who has thought a plan through completely and executed it before any adult could introduce complications. He told his father at breakfast on a Wednesday that Miss Vane had been playing the Brahms Intermezzo in A major and had mentioned she found certain passages technically interesting. He told Miss Vane, during his violin lesson, that his father had mentioned once that the Intermezzo was a piece better understood as a duet. Neither statement was precisely a lie. Oliver was meticulous about this. He then arranged to have a headache at precisely 4 o'clock, which brought Cecily to his room in concern, and left the music room, for the first time, containing only his father and Miss Vane, and the pianoforte, and the late afternoon light. Edmund arrived first. He stood at the instrument for a moment, then sat. He found the Brahms on the stand. It had not been there that morning, and understood, with the clarity of a man who has been managed by a 9-year-old, exactly what had happened. He sat there anyway. When Cordelia came in and saw him at the piano with the Brahms open before him, she was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed to the bench and sat beside him, not at a careful distance, close enough for the warmth of her arm to register against his. "Your son," she said. "My son," Edmund agreed. A pause. The late light came through the western windows and lay across the keys. "Will you play it?" she asked. Not as a teacher, as someone asking for something. Edmund looked at the score. The intermezzo, in A major, Margaret's favorite, his and hers, a piece that had lived for 3 years in the locked room of things he could not yet touch. He felt its weight. He also felt, for the first time, that the weight was not designed to crush him. It was simply what grief weighed. He placed his hands on the keys. He played. Cordelia listened without moving. When the last chord dissolved, she did not speak immediately. The silence after the Brahms needed to finish itself. Then she said, very quietly, she was right to love that piece. Edmund looked at his hands on the keys. He felt something in his chest that was not grief and was not its absence. It was something else entirely, something that had been waiting. In the space, grief had slowly been vacating for long enough. The argument happened on a Friday, which was, Cordelia reflected afterward, at least a straightforward day of the week for a thing of this magnitude. It began with a letter. One of Edmund's neighbors, Lord Sedgwick, had written to inquire whether the rumors he had heard at his club that Hartwell's music teacher was being received at the family dinner table and treated as something other than an employee were accurate, and if so, whether Edmund was aware of the commentary this was generating in the county. The letter was, in Sedgwick's manner, friendly in tone and absolutely pointed in purpose. Edmund showed it to Cordelia. He was not certain why, except that he had discovered he could not think clearly about things that concerned her without her present. She read it, set it down, said, "He is not wrong that people are talking. People talk about everything. It is their primary occupation. Look. Yes, but what they are saying in this case has a specific shape." She looked at him directly. "I will not pretend I don't know the shape of it." "Then we are in agreement that the talk is absurd." "I didn't say that." The words were quiet and very precise. "I said, I know the shape of it. I. The silence that followed had a different quality from all the silences they had shared in libraries and music rooms and galleries. This one had edges. "Cordelia," he said her name, her given name the first time, and she went very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, with the steadiness of a woman holding something heavy and refusing to drop it, "that whatever is happening between us in this house, and I am not willing to pretend nothing is happening, has a shape that I can see clearly. And I do not know whether you have permitted yourself to see it too. And I cannot continue being here, teaching your children, and sitting at your piano, and walking your gallery, without knowing whether you have." Edmund looked at her for a long time, at the ink-stained finger, and the hazel eyes, and the spine that did not curve under pressure. "I have seen it," he said. "I have been afraid of it." "Why?" He was quiet. Then, "Because I loved Margaret, absolutely, and to love someone else after that seems disloyal. To her, to what we were, to one. Or," Cordelia said gently, "it might mean that she made you someone capable of it, that what you had with her was large enough that it left room." Edmund looked at the window. Outside, Oliver and Cecily were in the garden, their voices carrying faintly through the glass. His children, who looked at Cordelia and then at him, back and forth, with the patient hope of people who have been waiting for something they could not name. He did not answer that evening. But he did not look away. Oliver knew something had happened before anyone told him. because his father came to the nursery that evening for the first time in 3 weeks and sat on the end of Cecily's bed and asked them both, in a tone that was trying very hard to be casual, what they thought of Miss Vane. Cecily said she thought Miss Vane was the best person who had come to Hartwell Park in a very long time, and also that she smelled like cedar and sheet music, which Oliver considered an accurate, if incomplete, assessment. Oliver said, "Are you going to ask her to stay?" Edmund looked at his son, 9 years old, with Margaret's quickness and the gray eyes that went directly at things without apology. "That would depend," he said carefully, "on whether she wished to." "She does," Oliver said. "She pretends she doesn't, but she does. She plays the Schubert slower when you're in the house, not when you're away. Only when she knows you might hear it." He stated this, as he stated all his observations, not as an accusation, simply as a fact that seemed relevant. Edmund sat with this information in the quiet nursery, with his children on either side of him, and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water and warm light arriving simultaneously, that he had been given something extraordinary. Not a replacement, not a consolation. Something new, grown in the particular soil of what he had already been. He found Cordelia in the library at 9:30. She was reading. She looked up when he entered and did not pretend she had not been aware of his footstep in the corridor. They had been past pretending for some time. "Oliver tells me," Edmund said, "that you play Schubert differently when I'm in the house." Cordelia set her book down with deliberate care. "Your son is extremely observant." "He is." Edmund crossed to the chair opposite her and sat down. "Cordelia, I am going to ask you something that I have been assembling the courage for since approximately the second movement of the G-flat impromptu. I would like you to give it proper consideration before you answer." She looked at him. Her hands were still. "Ask," she said. "Will you stay? Not as the music teacher, as mine, and theirs. If you will have us, with all our accumulated complications, and one extremely managing 9-year-old. Cordelia Vane looked at Edmund Fenwick across the firelit library and felt her 3 rules dissolve: the first into something better, the second into belonging that was freely given rather than taken, and the third into the simplest and most honest thing she had felt in years. "Ask me properly," she said. Her voice was steady and her eyes were full. Edmund rose from his chair. He crossed to her, and then, with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable, he knelt. They were married in December, in the village church where Edmund's family had been married for 4 generations, in a ceremony attended by the household Harriet Voss, and approximately half the county, all of whom had decided to be present in order to have a definitive account of whether this had actually happened. It had actually happened. Cordelia wore deep green silk, not the white of a first marriage, because she was not pretending this was something it was not, and carried a single spray of winter roses from the Hartwell garden. Edmund stood at the altar with his hands very still, and his expression the opposite of still, which was so unlike him that several people in the front pews felt their eyes sting unexpectedly. Oliver stood beside his father in his best coat, with his chin at the angle he had inherited, and his gray eyes trained on Miss Vane Cordelia as she came down the aisle on no one's arm, because she had no family present and had declined Edmund's suggestion of a proxy escort on the grounds that she was perfectly capable of arriving somewhere under her own power. Cecily, in the front pew between Harriet and Mrs. Thornton, the housekeeper, gripped Harriet's hand so tightly that Harriet, who was not given to sentiment, had to press her lips together against something that was not a sob and was only approximately a smile. When the vicar asked Edmund if he would take this woman, he said yes, with the directness of a man who has considered the question from every angle and arrived at an answer he intends to stand behind for the remainder of his life. When he asked Cordelia, she said yes with the directness of a woman who says what she means and has always meant exactly this. Edmund put the ring on her finger. It had been his grandmother's, a simple band with a single deep green stone that matched exactly the color of her gown, which was either coincidence or proof that he had been paying attention for some time. Afterward, in the carriage back to Hartwell Park, with Cecily asleep against Cordelia's arm, and Oliver watching the winter fields go by, with the satisfied expression of a plan correctly executed. Edmund took Cordelia's hand and held it. He did not say anything. He had learned, from Schubert, that some things needed breathing room to arrive. She turned her hand over in his and held back. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The music room at Hartwell Park was, at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in April, in a state of magnificent chaos. Oliver, now 13, was at the far end, working through a Beethoven sonata with the focused ferocity of a boy who had recently decided to be serious about music, and had therefore become approximately insufferable about it. Cecily, 11, was at the pianoforte, playing a duet with her father, who was sitting beside her, with his sleeves rolled up and his sheet music sliding off the stand, because he kept reaching over to correct her fingering without stopping his own part. Cordelia was in the armchair by the window, with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and a score she was not reading, watching her family. Her family. The word had required some time to settle into its proper shape, but it fit now the way a key fits a lock after you've carried it for a while, and the metal has warmed to the temperature of your hand. In the corner of the room, in the cradle that had been Edmund's, and then Oliver's, and then Cecily's, their daughter Agnes was asleep, one fist pressed to her cheek, making the small determined sounds of a person who is working very hard at unconsciousness. She had Edmund's dark hair and Cordelia's hazel eyes, and the combined stubbornness of both her parents, which Harriet Voss had declared, upon first meeting her, a formidable inheritance. The duet dissolved into argument, Cecily insisting she had played the third beat correctly, Edmund equally certain she had not, and Oliver stopped playing to adjudicate with the weary authority of an eldest child who has done this before. Cordelia put her cold tea down and watched the three of them bicker with the warmth of people who are entirely certain of each other, and felt the particular quality of happiness that is not excitement or relief, but simply rightness. The sense that the room you are in is the room you were moving toward for a very long time without knowing its address. Edmund looked up from the argument and found her watching. He held her gaze for a moment with the expression Oliver had first identified from a nursery window on a cold October morning, attentive, unguarded. The expression of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was still looking for. Then Cecily played the third beat again, wrong by anyone's measure, and the argument resumed, and Cordelia picked up her cold tea and laughed freely, fully, in the way she had learned to laugh in this house, and the sound of it moved through the music room like the second movement of the Schubert, finally given room to arrive. Agnes, in the corner, slept through all of it. She would learn the piano soon enough. If this story reached you, if you have ever been the one a child noticed first, before the adults caught up, or if you have ever been the one who needed reminding that warmth was still possible, leave a word below. We read everyone. Subscribe for a new story every week. Hartwell's Music Room fire is already lit for the next one.